For Qatar comes as the battle against the Islamic State group in Syria gains momentum. US-backed fighters are reportedly making progress in their efforts to retake the ISIS stronghold of Raqqa, and now observers are turning their attention to the next chapter of the conflict. Well, for more on both issues, I spoke to Syrian author and journalist Hassan Hassan, who's a senior fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy based in Washington, and the co-author of ISIS Inside the Army of Terror. Hassan Hassan, now Qatar's been handed 13 demands, including shutting down a Turkish base and the closure of broadcaster Al Jazeera. Can you tell me, in your view, is there any chance that Qatar will comply?
It's very hard to imagine that Qatar would comply with the demand. It simply means the ending of 2 decades of Qatar foreign policy, basically work in the Middle East, trying to expand its soft power and expand its network in the region and its regional standing.
So even though the deadline has been extended until tomorrow, do you think these demands were always made with the expectation that there'd be an extended conflict with Qatar?
Well, look, I say this based on information. I personally spoke with people who are directly involved in this push against Qatar. And I was told about 2 weeks ago that they're not really interested in Qatar compliance at the moment. They know that Qatar will continue to, play along or make promises that it doesn't fulfill. And from what I heard is basically they are convinced that Qatar is not going to change, and the only thing they can accept from Qatar is a kind of 100% compliance, and they don't think that's going to happen. So for now, they want to extend the sanctions. They want Qatar to feel the bite of the sanctions for a while.
And what impact could that have on Qatar's standing in the broader region?
Well, I think for now, Qatar is resistant, and the Qataris are hoping that at some point, when things start to be complicated and media starts to turn against the Saudis and Emiratis, that some people in Washington will start to raise the heat against the Saudis and Emiratis and tell them, you know what, let's get this over and done with. And I think for now, the Saudis and Emiratis have got reassurance from President Trump that he agrees with them, that Qatar has a problem, and that problem involves the support of terrorism and financing terrorism in the Middle East and beyond. And for now, there's a kind of a rapport. There's an agreement between the Saudis and the Emiratis on one hand and the Americans on the other, that pressure against Qatar can continue.
Can I also ask you about Syria and specifically the city of Raqqa, because US-backed fighters are reportedly making progress in their efforts to retake the Islamic State stronghold there. You've written extensively on this. Just how important is Raqqa in the fight against ISIS?
Well, Raqqa is the second most important fight against ISIS over the past 3 years after Mosul. It was the first town or city taken by ISIS, and this is where basically ISIS spent the longest building its statehood or state-building project in Raqqa. So it's important because once you dislodge ISIS from Raqqa, it's a heavy blow to the symbolism of the ISIS caliphate and so on and so forth. But also, Raqqa is strategically located in northeastern Syria, where ISIS could navigate the central Syria and southern Syria and eastern Syria. And once ISIS is dislodged from there, it will be much harder for ISIS in the future to operate in Syria in the same way that it has done so far.
The Syrian Democratic Forces say they're making progress in their effort to retake the city. In your view, are they close to achieving that goal?
Well, I think the gains made by the Syrian Democratic Forces so far have been quite impressive and rapid. The fight in Raqqa has reached a point where it has just got really serious. ISIS in Raqqa has been fighting differently than it fought in Mosul. In Mosul, it tried its best to delay and slow down the the advancement of its enemies into Mosul. So it sent suicide bombers outside the city, and they tried really hard to prevent them from breaching the walls of the city. But in Raqqa, these forces haven't really faced resistance from ISIS over the past 2 or 3 weeks.
So let's talk about the future governance of the city. What happens in terms of leadership and control of Raqqa if and when they do retake that?
This goes back to the idea, the importance of Raqqa, not only in the fight against ISIS, but for Syria. And I think there are so many factors coalescing around in Raqqa that makes it a very important city. One of the factors is what happens when the Syrian Democratic Forces retake the city. Who's going to govern after that? How the relationship between the Kurds and the Arabs, who are basically the main components of the Syrian Democratic Forces under the leadership of the Americans. What's going to happen after that? Is it going to be the Americans packing up and leaving, as they did in Iraq before that, or are they going to establish some sort of local governance to fill the vacuum and make sure that when they leave, there are people staying behind who could prevent ISIS from coming back or other jihadists from emerging in these towns? And I think that's a big challenge, not only for ISIS, but for Syria as a whole.
In your recent work, you've said that Islamic State could make something of a comeback after the liberation of Raqqa. How could that materialise?
Well, ISIS, for about a year now, they have been talking about their post-caliphate strategy. And this strategy involves a ceaseless campaign of attrition. When an area is liberated, ISIS starts to launch attacks, hit-and-run attacks or assassination attacks and so on and so forth, depending on the importance of the town liberated. And this strategy by ISIS is well articulated. We also saw it before, a decade ago in Iraq, and actually worked for them in Iraq, because once there's vacuum, they work very hard to fill it. And once there are emerging governance structures in liberated areas, they try to hit these ones and prevent them from becoming well-formed or full-fledged governance structures that will create an alternative to it. This is kind of a very important part of ISIS strategy. So even while the U.S. is expelling ISIS from these strongholds, Mosul, Raqqa, Tikrit, and so on and so forth, ISIS had already started shifting towards insurgency tactics. In fact, this has been going on, the insurgency tactics, for more than a year now.
Hassan Hassan, thanks for speaking to The World Today.
Thank you very much.